You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we are joined today by author John Glatt here to talk to us about his book, The Doomsday Mother, Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell, and the End of an American Family. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Go ahead and start by telling our listeners a little bit about your educational and professional background. How did you get into writing true crime?
My background's in journalism back in England. I dropped out. I was a dropout. I dropped out of school and worked for a music publisher. You might be able to see this, Bill.
Oh, interesting.
So that's my first job. I worked for a music publisher. I did tea and coffee and runs the post office. And I decided that I wanted to get into writing. So I managed to get into a local newspaper in South London and went from there. And then I used that as a stepping stone to come over to America in '82 and been here ever since.
Was the writing thing something that you were always interested in as a young man?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I love writing. It's something I enjoy doing. I'm very curious. I liked asking a lot of questions and finding things out. And journalism to me was the perfect occupation.
Absolutely, it was. So what then attracted you to the field of true crime? Because it really does take a very special type of person to be able to deal with the depravity that comes with the true crime field. What happened for you?
Well, I actually started, my first book was on rock and roll. It was an unauthorized biography of Bill Graham, in fact, the Fillmore East and West. And that whole concert promotion business, that was my first book. And then I did a couple of other books. I did one on River Phoenix. I did one on the royal family of Monaco. And then I had a very good friend who was writing true crime books for St. Martin's in New York. And he kind of husbanded me into it. And they gave me a tryout. It's probably 25 years ago. And my first book was an anthology of priests that kill. The second book was an anthology of evil. It's called Evil Twins, about cases of twins, either one killing the other or killing other people or whatever. And I went from there, really. And after that, I pretty well been doing true crime since.
But I have to stop you for a second, John. That's quite a turn. In other words, I also worked in the music business for a number of years. But that's quite a turn from Bill Graham to priests who kill. I know I'm skipping a step or two there. That's a pretty dark left turn, don't you think?
Some kind of segue, isn't it? Yeah.
It isn't to say that Bill Graham couldn't be evil, but he also did a lot of good things as well.
Yeah. But those obviously very different subjects. But both interest me, really. It's finding out the story. I love just finding out the real story. And that's what grabbed me about it, especially about Bill Graham, because I interviewed a lot of people that knew him from the rock bands from the times in the 60s and whatever, to get to know him try and get him to know as a person. Because unfortunately, he died by the time I started. I'm just very curious and I wanted to explore more. And it's the kind of same formula I use in true crime books. I try to speak to as many people as possible and try to get different views on what happened, what the person was like, and put them all together.
And that actually does speak to my next question, which is, other than telling the facts of the case and the story of the crime, what other goals do you have in mind when you set out to write a book about a case? And it sounds like one of them is get to know who these people were, but do you have other goals that you set out to do?
Yeah, I obviously want to write an interesting book, which will keep the readers finishing towards the end, or that would be, if I didn't do that, it wouldn't really work. But I just want to find out, I like to find out what made people do it. I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't pretend to be, to explain why people do what they do. I just want to present as much facts as possible and let the reader make up their own mind about what happened.
And so then how do you pick the cases? These days, there's so much interest in true crime, and you've had a great deal of success. How do you choose the cases you choose to write about?
I think they have to interest me. Obviously, they have to interest the publisher. If the publisher doesn't think the book will do well, they're not going to hire me to do it. I mean, that is a two-pronged sword there. But there's a lot of things that really interest me. For instance, the Doomsday Mother. I live up in the Catskills, and I was at a local bar talking to some friends. I'd never heard about this story, by the way. And a friend of mine started telling me about it and said, there's all these people, they're just disappearing off the face of the earth. It's like a very weird Mormon-based murder that seems to be going on. And I went straight home and started researching it. And this was right at the beginning, basically, is where are the children? And Laurie and Chad were still in Hawaii, fending off Dateline reporters and the local East Idaho news. So I got in there at the beginning and went from there. And my publisher liked the idea and told me to go ahead.
I felt like the book came out, and I think it's just because it's been on everybody's radar for so long, but I felt like the book came out really quickly. I was like, oh my gosh, how is there a book about this already? I'm so excited. This is great. I was so psyched when I saw it, and I know you're very much on top of the most recent cases. I'm in the true crime section at Barnes & Noble all the time, and you can't go into that section without seeing at least a couple of your books. So I'm always excited every time I see a new one.
No, I worked on this for about 18 months, actually. And obviously with the trial, there's new stuff coming out every day. I'm riveted to listening to the audio because I couldn't afford to go to the trial for 2 months, however long it's going to be. But there's a lot of new stuff coming out for the trial, which I wish I could have added to them. And maybe I can do an update to do that. I'd like to. But I got very lucky in that I had Chad Daybell's preliminary hearing. So a lot of the testimony from the FBI and the detectives about when they found the children's bodies in Daybell's garden came out at the preliminary hearing, and it made a lot of sense. And I can see there were things that I hypothesized when I was writing that now with the trial, I can see that I was definitely on the right line.
Are there things now that are coming out, John, that you're shocked by? Because when I read summaries of what has transpired, and you're obviously a lot closer to the details than most people would be, but as more information comes out, I just find myself rocked back in my chair. These people are sick.
Yeah, especially with Alex Cox, Laurie Vallow's brother. Yes, yesterday I was just spent today listening to the cell phone. They tracked his cell phone, GPS, Wi-Fi, and they marked him on the days that Tylee disappeared, who was the last known sighting, and JJ. And you can see he's moving from his apartment next door to Laurie's in Rexburg, Idaho, and then to Chad's to bury the body. And it all makes perfect sense now. And it amazed me just how much they could find out about him. And it's really been, for me, having done the book, really riveting to listen to this testimony.
What would you say are some of the most surprising things that you learned about Laurie and Chad and these sort of weird shared beliefs that they had in common as you completed research for the book? What were some of the shockers?
It amazed me how many people were under their spell, really. There were a lot of people that believed Chad Daybell was a prophet, and they followed everything he did. They read the books, the podcasts and everything, and they really believed he was for real. And the 144,000 that he told Laurie they were going to lead for the second coming, it just blew my mind that people really believe this. And it's incredible in this day and age that they didn't ask more questions, but they went along with it. And it made like past lives, reincarnations and everything. They believed in all that. But that to me was a real shocker, I think, yeah.
It does sound like, though, in reading about the Mormon Church, that there is a history of people within the Mormon Church kind of self-declaring as prophets. In other words, naming themselves as prophets.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some pretty horrendous murders, I think, involving the Mormon Church. And I think they're very embarrassed about this because they've distanced themselves as much as possible from this case because it's very bad publicity for them, I think. So there's that facet of it.
The part that the whole thing, I'm fascinated by the whole thing. So I guess I can't really say the part that I'm most fascinated with. But I was so curious how Alex Cox ended up as involved as he was in the case. Is it because he was so weirdly and maybe a little ickily attached to his sister? Or was it a predilection for violence? Or was it something else? What do you think caused him to get as involved as he was?
I think, I don't know if you heard the testimony by Laura's younger sister, Summer Shiflett. And she talks about, I think Alex had some kind of accident as a teenager and it did something to his brain. And she said he never really grew up after that. He was just a teenager. And when he became a man, he still processed thoughts like a teenager. I think that had something to do with it. I think one of the interesting things in my book was I got, although I couldn't name her, Laurie's best friend at Eisenhower High School in California. She gave me an interview where, they were inseparable. And she said in 12th grade, they were having a sleepover and Laurie became very emotional, flung her arms around her and said, Alex, who was like, I think 4 or 5 years older at the time, Alex was trying to have sex with her and she didn't know what to do. And her friend didn't know what to do or what to tell her. So it was never mentioned again, but the friend told me, because her mother was a teacher, that if she just wishes that she could have told the grown-ups what was going on, because maybe it might have changed everything. That's just hypothesis. But that was my theory, that they had a very close relationship.
And do you think that Alex became essentially a follower of Chad's?
He believed everything Chad told him, Chad and Laurie. Melanie Gibbs says that in her testimony. Alex believed everything. He believed in past lives, and Chad had told him that he'd been particularly selected for this life to be the protector of Laurie, that he had to protect her from evil. And that's what Alex thought. He was a warrior in this way. I mean, look at Joe Ryan, the third husband, Tyler's father, when he tasered him. Basically, Alex tasered him while Laurie looked on with Tyler. Well, they had a visitation. Alex was always he was a violent person, I think, too.
That part of the book was absolutely insane to me. I was sitting there shaking my head. Oh.
When it came out that Laurie and Tylee were sitting in a car watching it all happen, it's pretty scary.
It really is.
And I spoke to Joe Ryan's lawyer, very interesting, and he told me that the taser, it affected Joe and did something to him. He developed heart problems and everything, became an alcoholic and died pretty young. And the lawyer thought it was a direct result of being tasered like that.
Yeah, I was going to ask your thoughts on that. We can't technically 100% lay his death at Chad and Laurie's hands, but it sounds like we can indirectly put it there via Alex.
Exactly, yeah, the taser. But there's been a lot of talk about whether Laurie could have been involved in his death, because she definitely gave talks where she said that he was a candidate to be murdered for what he'd done to the kids.
And then at the same time, I'm very suspicious that Alex's death, which seems awfully convenient, he's effectively acted as an enforcer for Laurie and has been directly involved in the deaths of 2 of her husbands. And then Alex conveniently dies.
Yeah.
I'm very suspicious there.
I wonder if it was suicide, because he died, I think, after hearing that they were about to exhume Tammy Daybell's body. And I think 2 days before, he'd driven all the way to Mexico to buy some drugs and things. I'm not sure what pharmaceutical drugs there were, but he brought them back to Zulema, and he had the same kind of think stuff coming out of his mouth. Tammy did, in fact. They were talking about that yesterday at the trial, asphyxiation. But I don't know. I personally wonder if Alex, his heart gave way because he knew it was going to come down on him. And I think at that time, he also didn't know where Laurie was. Laurie and Chad had just disappeared to Hawaii without telling anyone. And I think Zulema had said that they were worried that they were the fall guys and they were going to take the heat for what Chad and Laurie had done. I think it was all coming back to Alex. But my God, if he hadn't died, that would be really interesting.
How did Laurie and Chad's beliefs differ from those that are espoused by the Preparing people and the LDS Church? If you had to categorize where they differed, what would you say is the biggest point of difference?
I'm not a Mormon. I don't really know the church. Sure. But when I'm talking to some of people that followed Chad in the beginning and then they separated because they couldn't, he was just out there. They didn't believe in the 144,000. The Church of the Firstborn was something that's against the Mormon religion. And then he did things about how he and Laurie were sealed in a Mormon, is it a chapel or whatever? But that's something they would never do. It's heresy. So I think that the Mormon Church, any believers didn't want anything to do with Chad and Laurie at that point.
One of the things that we talked about on Mind Over Murder recently is that how strange I thought it was that they went off to Hawaii as if that was on the other side of the world. Now, I lived in Hawaii when I was a kid. My dad was a naval officer. And it was further away then than it is now because when we were kids, there were no satellites and Hawaii felt like a very isolated place. This is back in the 1960s. But I couldn't quite figure out if that was their version of running away. They didn't even leave the 50 states. It wasn't like they went somewhere where there was no opportunity to be forced to come back to the U.S. to face trial or whatever, someplace without extradition. But they end up on a beach in Hawaii months after the disappearance of her children, weeks after the death of his wife, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Doesn't it seem incredibly naive that they thought that going to Hawaii would be enough to move them off the radar in Idaho and Nevada?
Naive, definitely. My theory is Laurie's parents always went to Hawaii. They loved Hawaii. Laurie spent as a child, she was taken to Hawaii. She fell in love with it. And obviously she moved to Hawaii with Charles Vallow, JJ and Tylee for, I think, 3 or 4 years. So there was always something about Hawaii that Laurie loved. And I think it was part of her romantic dream with Chad to get married on the beach in Hawaii. And I understand, in fact, I think she'd married Joe Ryan on a beach in Hawaii. That's when I was told by his lawyer, in fact. So I think that there was naivety, but that's where she felt that she needed to be with Chad. And of course, the wedding was exactly 2 weeks, 2 weeks after Tammy died, November the 5th. 2019. I, in fact, interviewed the I wouldn't say priest, but the clergyman that married them. A very interesting take on it, yeah. And he couldn't believe it. He said they couldn't wait. Usually couples that get married, they want to get their full hours worth of the marriage. He said they couldn't wait to leave. They were out of there about 40 minutes later.
Oh, wow.
He was quite pleased, I think. And the photographer I interviewed said they were very strange. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
In what way were they strange from the photographer's point of view?
They were behaving like teenagers. And he's in his early 50s. She's late 40s then, I think. And they're all over each other. And I don't know if you've seen the pictures. You know, he's playing the not the guitar, but whatever the Hawaiian instrument is.
Oh, the ukulele.
Ukulele, yeah.
That was all faked, obviously, and the champagne wasn't real champagne.
When we were preparing for today's interview, Kristin said something funny, which is they described Laurie as being very attractive, with the long blonde hair and so on. Chad Daybell is at best an average-looking guy. He's not movie star handsome or anything like that.
Right.
Is it the charisma that puts him across and connects him with so many people? What do you think it is, John?
Yeah, I think he was charismatic. People told me he was. He could give these talks with these visuals of North Korea and nuclear forces, Kim Jong-un, and talk about the end of the world. And he had this kind of charisma. And I think for Laurie, she had very low self-esteem. I think it fed into telling her she was a goddess and they were going to save the world together. I think he knew how to feed into her ego in that way. And I think to Chad, he was a womanizer. He'd been married to Tammy. I heard from their friends, in fact, that they didn't really have much of a sex life. He was always complaining about it. And he had a couple of relationships with followers of his book by telephone, these affairs by phone. I think he saw Laurie fawning over him, this attractive blonde, and just thought, this is who I want to be with. He just fell in love with the way she looked. And what was interesting when they met, he was vastly overweight, very dumpy, double chin, but a few months of Laurie, she gave him a total makeover. He must have lost a lot of weight. When you see the pictures later, I think she gave him a makeover. But they were obviously an odd couple. But I think they fed into each other, the sort of gasoline and oil. They ignited in this horrible, disgusting way.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
You characterize him in the book as almost being like a cult leader. Do you feel like that's the correct term for him?
Yeah, definitely. I spoke to a guy called Rick Ross, who is a cult expert. I've interviewed him for a few of my other books. He's very helpful. And he talked about it as being a cult of two, basically, Chad and Laurie. And he said it's definitely a cult, and it's that mentality. And there were more people, obviously. There was Melanie Gibb, Melanie Boudreau, Zulema, Alex. There was a whole group around them. And more names I heard during the trial, which I've never heard of before.
Oh,
so
wow.
it was obviously bigger than just two, but it was definitely a cult that he was leading.
Are they delusional in that they think that beyond the cult leadership and focus that seems to come mostly from Chad and his writings, did they really think they were going to be able to leave a trail of dead bodies everywhere they went and get away with it?
I presume they did. They did. They got away with Charles Vallow in Arizona. The police did investigate, and they thought it was self-defense, which was ridiculous. And that's one of the things when you watch the videos of them, Alex, Laurie, and Tylee being interviewed by the police there. It's really interesting, especially Tylee, in fact. I don't know. I don't think she bought what her mother was selling at all. She was very sassy, everybody said.
Mm-hmm.
She would call her mother out a lot. But they supported that Charles Vallow had come with a baseball bat and everything. And as far as I see, Charles Vallow was a great husband. He couldn't believe what Laurie had turned into. And there was going to be an intervention, I think. Charles Vallow and Laurie's brother Adam, they were going to do an intervention with the parents. And that's when Laurie discovered what was happening with emails. And Charles had even sent an email to Tammy talking about it. Yeah. And that's when he had to die, I think. Yeah. I think they obviously thought they would get away with it, and they did for a while. I think they would have got away with it to a certain extent if Chad hadn't sent that email to Tammy when they were obviously burying Tylee, and he said there's a raccoon, so I've been burning limbs. And that email, the smoking, talking about it at the trial yesterday, and that's what obviously that's where they found the kids. Otherwise, I don't think they would have found them.
Do you think that either of them would have resorted to this type of violence without the other?
Good question. I really don't know. As I said at the beginning, impossible to know. If they hadn't met each other, maybe he would have gone carrying on writing his books, and she would have been just going through more husbands, and a lot more people would be alive today. So it's really hard to know, I think.
Do you think that darkest impulse to actually kill people that are standing in the way, do you think that comes more from Chad or from Laurie?
I think Chad. I mean, they were in his way. He didn't want the kids there. He didn't want them around Laurie. He wanted Laurie to himself. They had to get away. I think they had to kill their spouses for insurance. That's what they were looking at. What, $1 million for Charles Vallow? And Laurie didn't know that he'd actually changed the beneficiary to Kay Woodcock, his sister, a few months earlier, until after they killed Charles. And then with Tammy, I was reading today, he got about, I think, $380,000 payout from insurance. They paid him. This is what he was spending in Hawaii. So I think that was a motivation too, the money. I mean, for the others, I think Laurie and maybe Alex, it was like when they introduced the concept of zombies, and these people had been inhabited by zombies, and the only way you could rid them was to kill the body, and that would free them spiritually. So you were doing the best thing you can for them. And I think that's probably what Alex believed. He probably believed that he was freeing JJ and Tylee by killing their bodies so their spirits could escape. It's bizarre to me. It really is. It's horrific.
The Chad books, does this zombie thing show up in any of his earlier writing, or was this a newer creation that he came up with as an excuse to kill off all of these people that were standing in their way?
Let's be honest, I read one of his books and I couldn't read anymore. They're so badly written.
Ouch.
I wouldn't recommend him as an author. But I understand the zombie thing was quite late. He introduced that later on. And that was his way, I think, of getting rid of Tylee and JJ because they were in his way. He didn't want them around.
It's a flexible set of beliefs, is what you're saying.
It changes all the time with him, I think. I just love the way that he had a definite date for the end of the world. I think it was by the some 20th, was it 2020? Or he was sitting in jail when that happened. And the world didn't end. I just would have loved to have seen his face that day.
That definitely would have been something I would have wanted to be a fly on the wall for, definitely. Okay, so as an English teacher, I am always interested in the writing process for any author that we interview. So can you tell me a little bit about your process? I've been trying to convince my students all year that they need to outline before they write a book. So you're either going to prove me right or you're going to prove me wrong. Which is it going to be?
I prove you. I spent 2 or 3 months doing a complete timeline of everything. It can run to 200 or 300 pages, single space. I get incredibly anal on this, but the timeline is the way it works. I can write through that. And you can see things that you wouldn't see ordinarily that coincide. My early books, I didn't really use a timeline, except for maybe there was some event that I really wanted to get into detail. But for the last few years, I do a complete timeline of everything. And it's really paid off, I think, because you can see things much more clearly. Because I had so much research for this. I mean, this whole room was just full of files and everything. And to have to remember where everything was without a timeline would be impossible.
I was going to say it really pays off for this book just in terms of there is so much to this case that I remember when we first started hearing about it, we were like, who died when and where and under what circumstances? It was so helpful to get your book and to finally see it laid out in order. I was like, oh, that's the order it happened in.
Yeah.
It very much helped.
Yeah, it's hard to get your mind around it. My new book, which is about the Murdochs in South Carolina, that was more complicated, I think. Really, I had probably had a lot more than I had on Laurie Vallow for that one, the research. It really was confusing. Timeline would be the only way to understand that.
And we do want to talk to you about that very much because we are so interested in the Murdoch case.
As you put together the timeline, and I know you're very research driven, does it come to mind that there's even more research required? Do you see gaps in the people that you've talked to or the people that you'd like to talk to?
Absolutely. I see a timeline. I'm going through it. I think I've got more questions I want to ask and things. So a timeline's very good for that. And I try and get as many people as I can to talk. And that's very important. But the timeline is invaluable in seeing things from different perspectives and getting the right questions.
How many different levels of agreement will you have? You mentioned a moment ago that there was a friend of Laurie's that obviously you interviewed but didn't want to be cited by name. So
I had to give her a pseudonym.
How do you work that in, but under the pseudonym, but you provide the information without clearly stating who it is?
Yeah, I use a pseudonym and then I put in parentheses, not her real name. When you're reading the book, you know that it's not. I don't like using a source said. I like to real person. But she was obviously, I connected with a lot of people on social media and they did not want their names coming out as being close to them. So you have to go along with that. And understandable too, I think.
Are you able to obscure enough detail, though, so that we can't figure out who or why happened to be?
I think people in this school friend, I think her friends probably could work it out, actually. Yeah.
But for the reader, probably less of a chance of figuring out, oh, that's actually who went to high school with Laurie.
Unless you had a class photograph or something and you went through everybody. But no, I respect their privacy. They talk to me on the understanding that I wouldn't give their real names.
How many people did you end up interviewing for this book, do you think?
Oh, God, probably 50 or 60.
Wow.
I'd have to look through, but a lot, yeah.
We're so excited about your upcoming book on the Murdaugh murders because we have been covering it a lot here on Mind Over Murder. That, too, is such a super complex case, like you were saying a few minutes ago. Tell us a little bit about it. Go ahead and give us the elevator pitch on it and tell us when it's coming out. You give us all the details, and we're so excited to hear about it.
I'm not going to give you too many of the details.
Sure, of course.
I want to say I've got a lot of new stuff in there, a lot of good interviews, and I don't want that to come out before the book comes out.
Oh, sure, of course.
In fact, it was lucky because I finished the book and then the publisher left I have 2 chapters at the end for the trial, which so I covered the trial totally in that. So that was a good ending. That was a very complicated book. And there's so many different facets of it. And it's not just Alex Murdaugh, it's the whole history of the Murdaugh family.
Oh, gosh.
100 years in the 14th district in South Carolina. And they really ruled it, like medieval kings in a way.
Yeah.
And they were law unto themselves. And I spent 3 weeks down there last year, talking to people and everything and getting the real feel of it. And it's just a fascinating case, I think. Totally different from this one, in fact. They're both fascinating, but very different.
It sounds like there's just so much to the Murdaugh case, and there are decades upon decades of corruption and political influence peddling. It's unbelievable how much has gone on with that family and that law firm.
Yeah, they were a law unto themselves. And they got away with it for years. And if it really hadn't been for Paul and the boating accident, he was drunk, he crashed the boat and killed Mallory Beach, this never would have come out or anything. That was what really sparked everything. And they couldn't really hide it any longer.
Had you submitted the manuscript for the book by the time it came out that Stephen Smith was being exhumed? How did you feel about that?
No, I think the book had gone to press by then.
Okay.
I did meet Sandy, his mother, who I went to a benefit to raise money for the headstone in Columbia. That's when I first went in there. So I met his mother, Sandy. I met his sister, who's really sweet. And then it meant a lot to them to find out what really happened. Because they know that Stephen was murdered. And yet they couldn't get anybody to take it seriously. It was all pushed under the carpet and hushed up. So at long last, there's a chance of finding out, what really happened.
Now, the Doomsday Mother, your Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell book, came out on St. Martin's Press. Is your next book, Tangled Vines, coming out under St. Martin's as well?
Yes, it is. All my true crime books, I'm proud to say, have come under St. Martin's Press. I've been with them for over 25 years now, so I'm very proud of that.
How does that happen, by the way? Most authors we know move around, yet you've been with the same house for all of these years.
Absolutely, because I have a very good relationship with my editor, Charles Spicer, and his staff, and it works really well, I think. I like working for them, and they seem to like me, so it's good.
As I said, I'm in the true crime section of Barnes & Noble most every weekend, and your books are never out of print. They're always there. So I'm always excited when a new one comes out. And so when I was paging through and I saw, John Glatt's got another new book coming out in August, I was like, okay, we absolutely have to see if we can get him to come on. And we do want to have you back when Tangled Vines releases.
This has really been great talking to you.
I do want to ask one more thing with regard to the Murdaugh case. Do you think Gloria Satterfield's case should be given another look?
Absolutely. I just read, obviously the murder case has now been resolved. But the Satterfield case, I just read this afternoon. I think through his lawyer, he's given a reply to the Nautilus. And Nautilus was the big insurance company. And he's now admitting that the dogs didn't push Gloria Satterfield down the stairs. He made that up. And that he can't remember if she was there to work or not, which would invalid the whole insurance thing. That just came out. I just read that today, in fact. It's all evolving. There's all these financial cases. I think there's like 100 different things against him there. There's a lot more coming out. And the same judge, the same prosecutor and everything is going to be a lot to watch.
Such an amazing case, and the level of corruption, it just goes deeper and deeper. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, it's taken the whole of Hampton down anyway, I think. The lawyers and the police are under investigation. It's just a very corrupt system that's been like that for so many years.
It is nice to finally see some of that dirt coming up, finally. So now that Tangled Vines is about to go to press, what are you working on now? Are you able to share any of that, or are you going to keep it under wraps for a little bit?
I'm taking the summer off. I haven't really had time off. It's been non-stop books for a while, so I think I need a few months off to get a fresh air and everything and come up for air.
I picture a whiteboard somewhere, John, where you've got all these ideas for your next book after the summer and your well-deserved time off.
Right, it's right there.
I'll let the record show that John is turning the camera and showing us. His whiteboard appears to be more of a bulletin board with ideas and pictures.
Yeah.
I noticed you didn't zoom in, though, so we couldn't tell quite what you were working on. So what are you going to do this summer while you have the time off?
I don't know. Look for different ideas. And I'm doing something for, I don't know, Graydon Carter, who's the editor of Vanity Fair, his website, Airmail. They commissioned me. I've written a piece about a murder that happened in swinging London in 1967. That's coming out in a couple of weeks, I think. That's something I've been working on. And I'm looking around for other ideas.
It's a fun background, although, once again, you're working on a murder.
Right.
You said you're up in the Catskills. Whereabouts?
Do you know Woodstock is 35 miles west of Woodstock. Bel Air Ski Center. Live in that. Nearest town is Margaretville. I don't know if you... Where are you based?
I'm in Virginia, and Bill is in Connecticut.
Right, yeah.
The book is The Doomsday Mother, Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell, and the End of an American Family by John Glatt. Currently out in stores, available on Amazon and wherever you get your books. And we're looking forward to having John back to talk to us about Tangled Vines when that releases in August. That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.